Been talking a lot about citric acid, whether it's present in dental formulations or found in various foodstuffs, like yogurt or soda, whatever, fermented milk. But because citric acid is among the most versatile ingredients you will ever see, today we're devoting today's discussion to it, including how it's sourced, another very popular name for it, its relationship to penicillin and Pfizer, its role in burning calories.
Wait, what?
Well, yeah, that's right. Well, we'll talk about it and examples of different formulations that comprise it. Some might be surprising. Hello again, I'm Dr. Rob, accompanied by my co-host Tami, and you're listening to Dental Formulator's Playbook.
I want to know. That's going to be so cool. Yes, back in episodes 26, I think 27 and 29, we discussed the citric acid and its presence in drinks
Yep.
and some foods like yogurt and fermented milk. However, we've also discussed its role in dental formulations.
Yeah, that's right. And we've been paying special attention because whether it's in the formulation or flavored water or food, like you just said, it's always either about preservation or flavor enhancement. And there's other purposes here that we need to talk
I was
about.
going to say, it seems like there's a lot of other fun things. So,
Yeah, so we're going to talk at least about probably at least three other purposes or situations where citric acid might be used.
okay. So,
And the very first thing we're going to talk about is the difference then between citric acid and
citrate.
sodium citrate.
It's
Yes.
so confusing to me.
Yeah, it can be very confusing. Okay. So, I know this is a big deal for you. Yeah, I know that. I know. So, if even if it does drive you nuts, what we need to look at is on the ingredient panel. You see citric acid oftentimes. Do you usually see citrates?
No.
No, you don't, right? And so, but even in the acid heavy episodes that like 26 and 27, we were talking about citric acid as one of the ingredients, for instance, in soda. But then once it hit water and at different pH levels than in water, you would have different types of citrate available. Remember, there was up to three different types of citrate.
Yes. Yes.
These were all negatively charged and they all dealt with, the release of different protons or hydrogens.
Okay. So, Dr. Rob, what is the difference?
So this is a good question, and by the way, you just addressed another purpose of citric acid, which we'll address in a moment. You didn't even realize it, but first we have to understand that citric acid, if that is going to be an ingredient that any formulator would add to a product, it is in a white crystalline powder. Okay.
Yes.
And the same thing can be said about something called sodium citrate. That's just another salt form. Okay. But that one is sodium citrate and you have citric acid. But just specifically talking about citric acid, once citric acid or sodium citrate, even, this is probably even sounding confusing anyway, doesn't matter. Even if both of these are immersed in water and they dissolve, they will both then resulting in the formation of the anion citrate. It's a negatively charged anion. It's just called citrate. Citrate, it could be citrate 1, 2, or 3 negatively charged.
Yes, I remember that.
And it all depends on the pH level that you're at.
Okay.
So that is really the transition from, either the salt form.
Same, but they're
crystal
not.
form,
Yes. Okay.
Until you put it into an aqueous system.
Okay, that makes more sense. So because when we formulate, we're looking at, for instance, right now, this is one of my prescriptions. I don't know if you can see it really well, but it's like an alkalizing solution.
Yes.
Both citric acid and monohydrate and sodium citrate dihydrate on the label. So what is that?
Yeah, so what that refers to, and you either have monohydrates, dihydrates, or even trihydrates, they refer to how much bound water that is present on either the sodium citrate crystals or the citric acid crystals as they're sitting in the container. So in other words, as the raw material. And it just means that they have not been fully dehydrated.
Okay.
So somebody
Makes sense.
Yeah, so you may not use pure citric. So any, formula house or whatever formulation that contains these, is it going to be sodium citrate? Anhydrous is what we would refer to that. Or is it going to be sodium citrate dihydrate or monohydrate? Or, same thing with the whole citric acid.
Okay, so basically just citric acid or sodium citrate.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
They both refer to these being very well dried, so much so that no bound water is attached, correct?
Yeah, but here's the point. Let's be practical about this, right?
Okay.
If these citric acid or sodium citrate salts, if you will, if those are going to be introduced into a water-based formulation,
Like toothpaste or
like
flavored
toothpaste or
water.
flavored water, how important is it really to be completely, absolutely dry? It's
Well,
not, right? And
right,
just like your medication, which is a liquid, it's going to go into your body, and our bodies are mostly made of
right.
liquid,
Okay.
right? And then, especially if it goes into the stomach and everything else, well, there's going to be water in there. Again, we don't need to have the very pure form of salt. That's going to
Okay.
cost more because that's extra time and energy
Absolutely.
that it takes in order to drive off any of the so-called bound water,
Okay.
right?
Okay. Starting to make a little bit more sense.
And this is why, if anybody ever had vitamins or if they ever get any kind of supplements or any kind of thing where there's a desiccant usually included, right,
Yeah.
in the container, that's supposed to absorb any atmospheric water that might be present
Yes.
that, might otherwise spoil that supplement or
Okay.
whatever.
That makes sense then.
And so, but that's not going to be the case here. You don't have to worry about a desiccant. These supply houses, provide these raw materials as a package container, and then there it
Mm,
is. There's very rarely is there any desiccant in there.
okay.
So, but anyway, it's just cheaper. Monohydrate, dihydrate, heck, even
Okay.
trihydrates, right? Are
These big
are
words are
are the
just
common
rules
forms.
of cost or
Yeah,
something.
are the common forms of these either
Okay.
citric acid or the sodium citrates. So
Okay.
now, if we were to take a look, since we brought up your prescription, and this is
Yeah.
one of the things that we wanted to talk about, this is, they consider this to be a systemic alkalizer. And I think that's pretty important because what does that even mean? Well, usually people that have issues with their kidneys, that could be a really easy solution to help fix that. If the kidneys aren't filtering properly, the blood could be too acidic. This is
Okay.
also the case if you end up trying to hyperventilate too much. You could actually make your blood too acidic by trapping too much carbon dioxide in your blood, as you breathe, and then it's released to the bloodstream. So, but in your particular case, the reason why your doctor actually recommended this is because you don't have a large intestine at all.
No.
Now, in the digestive process, and this might be interesting, influence, I don't know, maybe new knowledge for anybody listening, but whenever you're eating, yeah, it goes from the mouth, but then it goes into the stomach, which has a very low pH. Think hydrochloric acid,
Yeah.
so you're down in the 3 at most. And then the pH gradually increases as you go from as the food, as the bolus or whatever is, formed, and it progresses through the small intestine and the large intestine. So in the large intestine, the pH range is around 6.5 to maybe goes up
Okay.
to about 7 or so.
So through that process, it gets
Yes,
more alkaline.
it's just more alkaline. But if you
Okay.
don't have an intestine that can produce that alkaline environment, then it's going to be harder for your body to have the bloodstream then not have acidic issues. And the body's buffer in the bloodstream only is based on carbonates. And so, although this is a citrate, and this is a citrate formula, what it's going to do is it's going to allow the formation of more sodium bicarbonate in your blood.
Okay.
Okay, so it just helps to balance the buffering. And so that's one of the reasons why people take this. So for instance, this is different than taking a Tums, a calcium carbonate tablet that somebody says, "Hey,
Yes.
now I have heartburn
Yeah.
and I just had, a very acidic meal. How do I neutralize that?" Calcium carbonate or Tums or whatever, they can also work, but the citrates are even more effective because these are working in tandem with your body's buffer system.
Okay. That makes way more
You know,
sense.
the calcium carbonate, that's just, a neutralization
In
reaction.
the stomach itself helping to.
Right. I mean, that's just a neutralization reaction. Gas is usually,
Yep.
evolved, and that would be like carbon dioxide gas. So anybody who has that, maybe later on, they might burp, right? They might
Okay,
have
yeah.
gas trapped, and that's just something
Okay.
that happens. It can still work, but that is some of the differences. So sodium citrate, super important, actually, with the citric acid in combination, because you want a stable formula. It's just easier on the body. That this is just one way of being able to have a body maintain, some nice homeostasis with the blood.
Well, it's good to know that what I'm taking has a very definitive purpose, and
Yeah.
it is doing what it needs to do. So,
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, and so this is a neat example because a lot of
Yes.
people don't know that example. And honestly, you could probably even just make up your own solution. You don't need to have a script for this, and you even know that I even play for you, a little
Yeah.
bit here. As long as the chemist or the formulator, the manufacturer, whoever's making it, they just have to know whether it's a monohydrate, dihydrate, trihydrate
Okay.
form, because then that just shifts the measurements, right? The amount of
Okay.
each of the ingredient
Yeah.
introduced into the formula. So as long as that is good and understood, then it's all good.
Okay.
You know?
Well, that makes sense then.
Yep.
So you just mentioned manufacturing. So how is citric acid produced? Because it is a naturally occurring.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In fact, even here in the US, there's certain associations like the Natural Product Association, they have their own recognized label that lists ingredients that they consider to be natural.
Yes.
And that also means minimally processed.
Right.
And so, they would consider citric acid to be a natural ingredient. So, what do you think that natural source is?
When I think so, there's my naivete. I know that today I'm going to learn it much differently, but when I think of citric acid and its production, I'm thinking of like big bushels of fruits like oranges and limes and lemons, and then they're just like squeezing it so the citric acid can be extracted. And I'm sure that's not how it works, but in my mind, it's citric acid, right?
Yeah, I mean that vision is creative, and I think it's going to be very entertaining, but it's not even close to how it's produced. But
Okay.
the form of the citric acid that is produced in a different way, that is naturally produced, would be the same type of citric acid that would happen if you did squeeze an orange or squeeze a lemon or squeeze a lime. It's the same type, but it's by a whole different other natural method.
Okay, so that's what we're here to learn about. That's what I want to know about.
Yeah. So what that process is?
Yes.
Fermentation.
Okay, so you mean microbial and produce, like
Yeah.
how lactobacilli create lactic acid from sugar.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a fermentation process, right? And that's a great example. That lactic acid is coming from lactobacilli. And
Okay.
It's really interesting because other bacteria can also produce citric acid, just like lacto can produce lactic acid.
Right.
But that's actually not the one that we're going to talk about. And although it can be, we're actually going to be talking about a fungus.
Okay, so not a bacterium.
Yeah, no.
A fungus like how penicillin's produced?
Yes, that's right. And we're going to touch on that. So, there are corynebacterium as well as Bacillus licheniformis. They are all known to produce citric acid. Okay, so
Okay.
bacteria can do it. But certain fungi, have awesome, just easy, straightforward processes in creating the citric acid that it could allow and does allow for scale up at the commercial scale in order, like tons of production, like thousands of tons, that
Wow.
are, produced throughout the world.
Which
And
clearly is probably easier than squeezing a whole bunch of oranges in one.
yeah,
So
yeah, that's right.
we mentioned penicillin. When was it first discovered, and is there a specific fungus that's associated with
Yeah,
it?
now, and we're going to have to go back to penicillin because this is really important. The citric acid fermentation by fungus, Aspergillus niger, is really the workhorse of this
Okay.
entire industry. That couldn't have been done without understanding the penicillin. But then also, penicillin couldn't have been widespread and known throughout the world and even mass produced without knowing the intricacies of how citric acid was produced by this Aspergillus niger fungus. And so
Okay.
1928, yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but
I'm
again,
Brooklyn and trying.
in 1928, Alexander Fleming, and he was a British researcher, he discovered contamination of a Staphylococcus bacteria culture he was trying to grow.
Okay.
What that contamination was the fungus. And it was ultimately became known as Penicillium notatum. However, he found that it was really effective against other bacteria, even though it had very short, time span. So it was quick, it worked really fast, but the ability for the bacteria to
Come
then,
back.
come back and
Okay.
eventually have the resistance would come about, and make it, urgently
Makes
needed to
sense.
have a different antibiotic. But at that time, it didn't matter because there was no antibiotics, right? The only thing that was closest to any kind of microbiological kind of approach or any kind of medical approach in fighting bacteria-based infections was done using viruses, actually. And the Russians had done this a long time. They were the pioneers in this. So that's how they would typically do it. So their antibiotics were really virus-based. Now, for the rest of, the US, Europe, and everybody else, they weren't using viruses. So the penicillin was the very first approach of creating, how do we create an antibiotic that's been produced by fermentation
Okay.
to be able to
Okay.
address these bacterial infections. In fact, so although he accidentally discovered it, right, in 1928, and I believe there was a Nobel Prize when it, eventually, won for that. It might have even been 1945. I can't remember, but there was a woman that was in Boston area, I believe, that had an infection. It was a streptococcal infection. It was due to some kind of miscarriage
Okay.
issue that she had. She was 33 years old, and she had a doctor that didn't know what to do because at that time, you're talking about, even in 1942, when this woman went to the hospital with this infection, obviously, there weren't, again, antibiotics around. So although he discovered in
Right.
1928, there was no mass produced
Wow.
capability present yet.
Less than
Okay.
100 years
Yeah,
ago.
less than 100 years ago, right? So fortunately, she was the patient of a doctor that had also other patients. And one of these other patients happened to be a doctor that was friends with another pathologist that was, he was an Australian pathologist in London training, and he was trying to, not training, but he was actually spearheading efforts during the early stages of World War II. And he
Okay.
said, well, you know what? We might be able to figure out a way. And because we're already trying to figure out
Mhm.
how we can mass produce this, we're trying to work with other pharmaceutical companies. One of those pharmaceutical companies was Merck, and they had an outfit
Okay.
in New Jersey, even though Merck is a German based
Yes.
manufacturer. And again, you're looking at this time in 1942. So you can imagine that would be really challenging. We want
Yes.
to have a penicillin, drug. We're going to try to give it to this woman. This is one of the first women to actually receive the penicillin
Wow.
treatments. A small amount was able to be delivered to her from the New Jersey facility, and it ended up, you know, fixing her, curing her, right?
Oh.
Eliminating that staph or streptococcal infection. I think she ended up living to be about 90 years old, by the way.
Hmm.
But the whole thing is, all of that, especially with her success, because it happened so fast, like the improvement was like within the first 24 hours, all of a sudden she was getting better, that the British government and the US government, they put a challenge out there for American pharmaceutical industries to say, look, you guys need to figure out how do we scale penicillin production.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different balls in the air, but everything
Yeah.
relates to it, right? And so, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
what do you think about that?
I, so much in our history is about accidents and whatnot. So that actually turned out to be a huge benefit, right? So what ended up being a story involving patients and doctors from the
Yeah.
USA and Australia and England as well as a German pharmaceutical company. In fact, I think I recall a whole season of Outlander series based Claire, who had been a British nurse during World War II, right? And she would go back in time and one of her many activities and all that, she actually ended up cultivating penicillin from mold, using it to treat infections in colonial
Yeah, that's
America.
exactly right. Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah. But you're probably thinking what?
It's really interesting, but how do we get to citric acid?
Yeah, well, I'm almost there. So the challenge that was put forth then to the pharmaceutical companies introduced a new player into the market.
Okay, so it's not Merck, so
No.
who supplied the initial amount to help the woman fight her strep infection. So
Yeah, so it was a small time manufacturer at that time, and the manufacturer was Charles Pfizer and Company.
Pfizer. Oh my gosh, they're a powerhouse.
Yeah, they actually found a way to mass produce the penicillin. And, that was really important because without that, obviously, you wouldn't be able to have that medicine, the first world's antibiotic, being able to be
Right.
delivered to Allied soldiers, for instance, on D Day in 1944.
Wow.
And how they did it was they said, well, look, Charles Pfizer and Company, the researchers there inside, and of course, the challenge put forth to them and they said, well, you guys recently have had success in scaling up citric acid, right? And they said, well, yeah, can you do this with penicillin? They did, but they had to slightly change the trick. And so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so production of citric acid was actually scaled up by Pfizer then?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So this was the key part. So the Charles Pfizer company would not have been able to scale up penicillin if they hadn't had success in scaling up citric acid.
Okay.
So let's talk about the citric acid part then and the details behind there. But know that the method had to be slightly altered, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the penicillin had to be made using a submerged technique, and this submerged technique is really similar to how certain molds can produce, for instance, glycolic acid.
Okay.
And that was the one switch that the Pfizer company needed to make. The researchers there, the chemists and the engineers, they had to say, okay, well, what happens if we just change this one detail? Because usually how citric acid was produced is that'd be like just having a pan, and then you would just get these white crystals that would just settle on top, and it was easy to collect those. You can also reprecipitate these things, and we're not going to go into that. Always with the citric acid, you would always have to use a calcium based salt as well as some sulfuric acid. And even to this day, that's still done. But you still have to get the innate citric acid, at least the citrate part, present in order to be able to collect it.
Right.
And so what the researchers did is they said, well, it's not growing nicely on a pan. What about if we emerge or submerge this, mold based milieu, way deep in the bottom of a pan with a ton of other broth and all of its components there? Might that work? And it did. So how did they figure that out? Well, there was a dairy researcher at the Department of Agriculture here in the US that published a very important paper in 1917. His name is James Curry, and he was the one who actually just created this whole bump that pushed this industry into this direction. Again, even at that time, and even in 1917, it was not well understood the conditions for how citric acid would be produced from molds like
Right.
Fergillus niger, which is the mold that he chose to use. And there's other molds that can do this, but that was the prototype,
Wow.
the default worker that he ended up using to do that.
Okay. So a lot of history and information. It's crazy how, dairy and all these different industries and countries. And so it was done in 1917.
1917, yeah. And this was really important because even at the time of that paper, other researchers had said, look, we understand, and even Curry even said this too, we understand we're at the forefront infant industry, this chemical industry that's using microbes to
Yes.
do this. Why is that even important? Well, it's because existing chemical synthesis can get really expensive, and it's going to take, one of the costs for expensive is we just don't know, think about all the different starting materials. If you're trying to produce a citric acid, you have to make sure you have all your reagents, you got to have all the
Right.
controlled reactions. Here, a mold could do this automatically.
Which is
And
fascinating.
yeah, so for Curry to really, outline all the steps in his 1917 paper, just really fantastic. And, it just, and, not only did he do that, he also dumbed it down, if you will, too. I don't want to say dumbed down in a bad way, but before that, there were so many other recipes that were calling for like 8 or 9 ingredients into the broth in order to coax the fungus in order to produce the citric acid. But nope, he said, you don't even need ammonia. You don't even need nitrogen. In other words, there was a school of thought you had to have iron, you had to have nitrogen. No, you don't necessarily have to have those. You needed to have, yes, obviously some kind of substrate to start, like a carbohydrate or sugar, but you just need maybe some sulfur, some phosphate, some magnesium, and if you can control the amount of potassium that you add, boom, you can get really nice output.
Okay, so
Pretty
it sounds like you said, it's in its infancy, this microbial stuff. But it sounds like there were other people before him, but he really nailed it down, right?
Yeah, he nailed it down,
He
and that's
made
right.
it much simpler and easier.
Yeah, he did. And I do have to say he did credit a guy that had a patent in 1913 issued.
Okay.
And this researcher's name was Zahorsky. And it wasn't assigned to anybody else. I think it just was his own patent. You don't see this come up too much. You have to read his paper to even understand that
Curry's paper.
Yeah, Curry's paper. Yeah, you have to read 1917 paper because Google doesn't even draw attention to this. AI tools and other researchers
yeah.
don't. And I can understand why, because this patent, by the way, is only 1 page long and critically relies on citric acid already in the broth to be able to produce more citric acid from
Okay.
fungus. So it's a little
Yeah.
strange, but here's where we remind people that just because it's a patent doesn't mean that it works. You're not proving it out.
That's a great example.
You're not giving all the steps. There was no data that was shown.
Okay.
There was no recipe for doing it. You just had an introduction with,
Okay.
this is some of my general observations, and I'm claiming certain things. And
But it was Curry who
but it
really
was, yeah.
brought forth and shared more details on this, right?
Absolutely. And so, I think that that's awesome. And, again, without his work, think about that. A dairy researcher at the Department of Agriculture in the US. It wasn't at a university.
Wow.
It wasn't at an established pharmaceutical company or even an emerging one. It wasn't even the Charles Pfizer company,
Yeah.
This was somebody that was in a government agency doing this. And so you would have to ask yourself, he would have to be motivated just by curiosity, wanting to go
Yeah.
in this direction, knowing that there's going to be a future. This is where the future is going to be. Even 100 years later, right now, this is how citric acid is still being produced.
Which
In
is
fact,
amazing.
this is how some of the stevia is being produced, right? Like the Cargill makes, it's all by fermentation. A lot of the products that, especially specialty products, they're being produced by microbial fermentation methods. The tricks are now trying to get maybe proteins to be produced, but that's a little bit trickier. But right now, with the small organic acids, maybe
Even
with some
after 100 years.
100 years, yeah, it's amazing. But he knew this, and it was just his strong desire to know and then to share. Because I can guarantee you, he probably did not get any, for instance, royalties. He didn't become
Yeah,
like the
no.
wealthiest person in the world, even though his steps allowed for citric acid everywhere to be used everywhere in all these different industries. We haven't even, touched
Oh
about
my
that. We will at
gosh.
the end.
Those,
But it also led to the penicillin scale up because
yes.
it was all of the same details. It had to start somewhere. And
Okay,
yeah,
so
so I cannot say enough great things about Curry.
that's a lot of really good history and information. And I would not have guessed citric acid and penicillin were so
Yeah.
intricately entwined, but it's
Yeah.
really important stuff. So we're talking about citric acid. How do then the molds or fungus or
Yeah,
whatever
absolutely.
mass produce this citric acid?
Well, yeah, I guess that's the question, right? So the first thing that you have to consider is, well, how long does it take for these metabolites to be created? Do you understand what I mean by metabolites?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so the metabolites are whatever chemical is produced through either synthesis or decomposition.
Okay, that helps.
Okay, so and the time span for all of these can be anywhere from, 1 day to 12 days or whatever.
Okay.
It can, or even longer, even shorter, depending on what microbe you're talking about and
Okay.
depending on how it's been modified.
Makes sense.
Like even today with the CRISPR technology that's usually devoted mostly to bacteria, not so much molds, although it has been, I'm sure. But I'm not up on, look, I'm not a mold researcher. And in fact, from a formulation point of view, you hate molds, right? You never want to see molds. You think
Yeah.
Aspergillus niger and that's black mold and that's going to be contaminating your product. That's like the last thing that you want.
Right.
And we can understand that, but it's just funny that it also produced something very healthy and very needful that
Yes.
that we want. So the first metabolite that's produced from the Aspergillus niger, whenever it consumes sugar or starches, but generally sugar, is
Okay.
going to be citric acid. If it allows for prolonged exposure in the broth of whatever, remember I said it's going to have magnesium, some
Right,
potassium, it
right.
might bubble in some CO2. That could be a possibility. Might have some phosphate in it. If it goes longer than 7 or 8 days, again, this is back in Curry's time. Things have now changed, and
Right.
it's more efficient, right? Engineers that worked
Absolutely.
with this, they know how to optimize these things. If it would go beyond 7 or 8 days, all of a sudden you start getting oxalic acid. So that's
Okay.
another type of acid. Sometimes that oxalic acid is used to help clean, to help actually
It's a
remove
more
ions.
powerful type of cleaner.
Yeah, sometimes, so sometimes that is marketed as a cleaner or
Okay.
rock cleaner or something, I don't know. But oxalic acid is also sometimes put into dental formulations, and I know that, for instance, I've seen Procter and Gamble have some patent
Okay.
applications that include that.
I didn't know.
So it goes from the citric acid to oxalic acid, then just to the generation of carbon dioxide
Okay.
until it actually starts to form that mycelium, that felt like fuzzy filamentous material, matte stuff.
Okay, so
That is, yeah.
what we think about
Right.
with mold, the stuff that if you find it in your
Right.
fridge, you got to throw it out.
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, if it goes on for too long, then you're way past the production of citric acid, oxalic acid, even CO2 generation. Now you're getting into the life cycle really of the mold, where now it's growing these support system for when
Yeah.
then it's gonna spore. And then it'll either,
Okay.
I mean, honestly, if you find this stuff outside, that's where and how, for instance, mushrooms can grow,
Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah. So wow, citric acid basically is the very beginning phase of fermentation.
yeah, that's right. For this Aspergillus
Right.
niger, fungal species, yes,
Wow.
absolutely. So all you got to do is just cut off the fermentation then. Don't let it proceed to the oxalic acid. You can control that not only with time, but
Yep.
also how much of the nutrients that you add. In this particular case, even Curry he showed in his 1917 paper, just control the amount of potassium chloride that you have.
Okay.
You don't want to put in too much or else you might get more oxalic acid. It might just progress
Okay.
that life cycle there.
So it's a natural thing.
So it's just a natural thing. So, and again, that's why it's considered a natural process. So, but, the citric acid that is produced, just for, any avoidance of doubt, it's the same type of citric acid that would be found from a squeezed lemon.
They're identical.
Orange. They're identical. Yep.
To me, that's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, we just talked about metabolites, right? Well,
Right.
biochemists actually refer to the mitochondrial processes from which carbohydrates, fats, and some amino acids are digested, if they're catabolized, if they're broken down, whenever they're converted to energy, right? This is known as part of the Krebs cycle. The researchers, and he won a Nobel Prize with another researcher in 1953 for this. This cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. And this is the process. There's like 8 enzymes involved, but the very first metabolite produced in the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle is, what do you think?
Citric acid.
Citric acid, yes.
Okay.
So, that is how naturally it is.
Tied to our body
Exactly.
function.
And Curry, and again, he might not have known, the researchers might not have known all the details about the Krebs cycle beforehand.
Because it came much later.
Yeah, it came much later. But they knew that this fungus was eukaryotic, just like humans and plants and animals and, even yeast, right? I mean, they potentially have the ability to produce the citric acid. So the biochemists know that the human body and the plant and, an animal, we have the ability to innately produce citric acid, and we have to in order for energy production in general.
So that's how it's tied to, caloric and
Exactly.
whatnot.
That's how it's done. But
it's coming around.
it's all linked, and that's the really
interesting
neat way. But Curry was able to figure out how to exploit that cycle in the fungus in order to coax what you want out of that. So
that is very cool. So there's so much information in my head right now, but I know you use it so much in formulation, and it's in so many products that we use, whether it's cleaning or food or medicine or whatever, that the one thing for me that I learned so far is the differences between citric acid and citrate, which has always bothered me. And it seems, tell me if I get this right, citric acid then is that crystalline white powdery stuff.
Yep.
And then if you put it in water or aqueous or some kind of solution, basically hydrolyze it, then it becomes the citrate.
Yeah, the anionic or negatively charged form of that just naturally develops in the presence whenever it's immersed in water. That's right.
Okay. So we've talked about so much. We've talked about citric acid, citrates, the source of citric acid, the biochemical Krebs cycle of citric acid, even pharmaceutical examples, the buffer and whatnot. So
there's other things. So the nomenclature is going to be another one. So dental researchers might talk about citric acids just in terms of small organic acids. Usually that's what they say whenever they're like, well, the mouth, it produces like acetic acid or lactic acid, really by virtue of the fermentation processes. Or if we're talking about dietary erosion, and that's coming from the citric acids or maybe even acetic acids that might be found in, for instance, fermented milk and everything else. Chemists, on the other hand, might just refer to them as carboxylic acids. They might say dicarboxylic acid, tricarboxylic acid. I've done it before. I mean, there's patents even with Procter & Gamble.
That's what makes science confusing sometimes.
But probably the more familiar term, and this is used by formulators for sure, especially in the cosmetic space, is referring to these types of carboxylic acids as alpha hydroxy acids or AHAs.
Yes. Okay, so that would explain why we have some of these products than on here. So
Yeah, that's right.
I see everywhere in the beauty world, especially various creams, especially for the face, and whether the biggest thing I notice is that whenever we do use that you're supposed to stay away from UV light.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. The products are gonna be effective.
Yeah, that what I was gonna say next is that the AHA, everyone's grabbing it. They want something with AHA.
Yeah, and they do. So like what is the difference and what are the levels
Yes.
here? This is where it's going to get a little confusing because the levels might be comparable to what is found in candy. By the way, candy might have up to 3% at most. So you're
Okay.
think about the tartest thing that you've ever, yeah, just really that might have the most tartness. But
Okay.
you don't want to go too high because then it starts to get painful and nasty, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you just don't want to go too high. So usually it's going to be under 3%, probably
Yeah.
1% range for candies. Some of these A products might have it as low as that. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Usually your toothpaste won't have it at that high of a level.
We never use citric acid.
We usually put it in around 0.1%. Some maybe will put it in a 0.5%. I don't know. If they do, I would hope that it would be buffered with sodium citrate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
And the reason why you want to buffer it is because, first of all, there's two parts, right? In any buffer
Buffering.
set you
That's what you've
have,
taught me.
right? You have a salt, and then usually you have an acid, and those two work in concert with one another so that there can't be huge changes in either alkalinity or acidity whenever something acidic or alkaline is spiked into it.
So it keeps it's buffering, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's
keeping
it's
it in that more
buffering.
neutral area.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yep. You
That
know,
would have been good to know.
and
Science.
and again, that's another reason why in your pharmaceutical product there's the two
Makes sense.
components. They're not just going to put in sodium citrate, they're not just going to put in citric acid. You need both in order to have a well-balanced formulation. So, yeah, so you would see maybe that kind of balancing maybe in certain gels, maybe some mouthwashes, and it'd be maybe 0.5%. But we're talking some of these products, some of these cosmetic, personal beauty products, they can have up to 90%, 90, up to 90% of these AHAs. In other words, citric acid, lactic acid, acetic acid.
They're just trying to make it sound fancy.
They are trying to make it sound fancy. And that is
Yeah.
absolutely true, but they are very effective. I mean, but the levels are going to be commensurate with the intended purpose. Is this a peel?
Okay.
Is this a serum? Is this a cream? Is this meant to be put on once a month, or is this daily? Is this an every 2 week kind of formulation?
Sometimes I do see the concentrations because I think they're trying to tout it as a certain thing, but a lot of times you really don't know.
They don't. That's right.
I combed my cosmetics because I knew we'd be talking about this, and it's really hard to understand.
Yeah, no, they don't. They're not required to list that. That is something that is definitely not something that is
Proprietary then.
Yeah, it's going to be proprietary. It might be in patent applications should they file those. Otherwise, it's going to be a trade secret.
Okay.
And even if they do file a patent application, it'll have a range
Yes.
in values, right? So, but the point is, and the part that gets really frustrating is whenever a brand does not test it. So I'm not talking about dental products. I'm even talking about A products on your clean.
Right.
You might combine, for instance, lactic acid with citric acid, but does it have the same potential? Or is it better? Or is it worse relative to just using one of those AHAs alone? Unless you have testing, clinical testing, or I know that there are some models which use pig skin. Pig skin is most similar to the human skin.
Yeah.
And so maybe they can show that, but really you need in vivo clinical on a person, just a topical study. Why? Because that also shows if you have any kind of sensitivities, right?
Yeah, I definitely try to choose products that have some kind of. I know we always
What
want
products
data.
do? What does the AHA do? Does it peel off dead skin? Does it clean this stuff? Yeah, absolutely. Another one, we're not going to talk about it today, salicylic acid. That's a beta hydroxy.
Okay.
Acid. And that one tends to be more oil soluble, although you can make it water soluble. There's tricks to do that, but we're only going to talk about alpha hydroxy.
Because there's already a lot with citric acid.
Well, and that is what it is.
That's crazy.
It's the citric acid.
I would not have thought that
citric acid. Yep.
Was just a fancy way to say citric acid.
And that's going to be the most common form of it in these products. It won't be acetic acid or lactic acid. Generally, it will not be. It'll be citric acid.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Now, there's also another use for this. So in addition to all like cleaners and like the cosmetic stuff, you can actually use it not on your person then, but also on your countertop.
So like in everyday cleaners, not like
Yes.
facial cleaners, but everyday
Everyday
cleaners.
cleaners. Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, as an example, here's a US patent for low toxicity, good antimicrobial activity, and excellent cleaning performance, cleaning composition. That's really the description of this patent that was issued to Clorox in January of 2025. And they
Recent.
recent, and it's by Clorox. People have heard of Clorox, right? And that ranges the citric acid content between 0.5 and 3%. In fact, that's their claim one. So,
That's so fascinating.
yeah,
Okay, so well, it makes sense. It works well on your face. It's, going to work on your table and
yeah,
counters, I guess.
yeah.
So they're not the only ones, right? Though there are like Clorox. There's a lot of other cleaning agents
Oh,
that are
absolutely. Oh
marketed,
my,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Just go on Amazon and you'll find just loaded with stuff. You'll have some that are maybe going to be focusing on acetic acid. I mean, even if you have,
Which is like vinegar, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, some people even say that your water tank, even if you have a tankless water heater or whatever, your
Yeah.
water tank should be cleaned. And this is, what do you think they use? They're using acetic acid or concentrations of that. They might,
For vinegar that you can buy
yeah,
at the
or a
store.
vinegar. Now they might be putting in some like a detergent like sodium lauryl sulfate to actually help that out.
Okay.
Clorox did in their patent because it does. Surfactants, by virtue of the definition of a surfactant, really helps to coat the given surface that you're wanting to treat. So, if you use,
So it would disperse it.
yeah, so if you have an espresso machine,
Yep.
right, you can use distilled water, but then you can also clean it also with
Yes.
some of these small organic acids, these alpha hydroxy acids, namely citric acid, or I guess in this particular case, you can even use, acetic acid, but, whatever. But some of these products are especially useful for toilet bowl cleaners because you need that chelating ability, especially from citric acid, to attack the red stains that sometimes develop in the bowl where the water, meets the air surface. And so,
Okay, so I didn't think citric acid was this involved or anything. So is there anything else that we need to know?
yeah, absolutely. I think that,
Sure.
yeah, we've already talked about buffers, not only for you ingesting it,
Right.
but the same type of buffers are also used in RNA preservation. So samples of like RNA, DNA, you
Okay.
don't want other metal ions that might be present to somehow corrupt that RNA structure or DNA structure. So sometimes buffers are put in there to trap some of those metal ions. So
Such a critical
just
substance.
from, a preparation
Yeah.
lab-based thing, if you're trying to assess DNA or RNA for whatever reason, right? That is another example. But there's also a really fun one that is, I don't think it's as popular, but it's fascinating.
I want to know.
And it is citric acid or malic acid, but you can encapsulate it. And what does that mean?
Yeah,
Encapsulation,
exactly.
right? So you would have the dry, crystals, the dry or dry enough, even if they're
Okay, so
anhydrous.
citric acid.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's, citric acid could be anhydrous, even could be dihydrate. I'm not saying it has to be perfectly
Or use all the big words. We're acid.
just citric acid, and you can coat it with and they spray coat it. So think of using it. What they spray coat it with are oils actually. So you can spray either or dip either one, whatever. Usually it's done by spraying. You can use coconut oil, you can use hydrogenated vegetable oil, you can use palm oils, and the whole purpose of this is to prevent the acid, whether it's again malic acid or citric acid. Again, both of these are alpha hydroxy acids.
Right.
You want them to not interact with the rest of the ingredients, whether it's in a food.
Okay.
Generally, if it's going to be in a food, unless you were going to do some kind of other reaction where you wanted to force some kind of acid-base reaction.
Okay. So in citric acid, when put in water, readily gets
Readily.
hydrolyzed, right, and
Yep.
becomes citrate. By covering it or spraying these fats on it, this encapsulation then protects it.
Yeah, it prevents or delays that kind of interaction until the fat layer melts.
Okay, so
how would that
an
happen?
example of that.
Sausage. So if somebody were to make their sausage or their own hamburger meat and they wanted to have the citric acid, but they don't want the citric acid to prematurely react with the amino acids, the proteins that are in the sausage,
Okay.
or the fats, or any of the other ingredients that are going into this composition of meat, then you could use an encapsulated version. By the way, yes, you can buy encapsulated versions of the stuff on Amazon.
I had no idea.
And what that can do is that you can cook the meat then as it gets the temperature. Then, depending on what the encapsulation fat was, the fat will actually melt off. And now you can get right before you're ready to serve the meat, the sausage or whatever you're making, then the acid will then be
Do it for boosting stuff.
exactly into the formulation, and then it's ready to
Interesting.
go. So that's one way. That's probably the easiest way.
Oh my gosh.
But there was another interesting method that I saw. There was a patent that was filed by Mondelez, and at one point they had the Kraft Heinz, brand. I like the Heinz ketchup.
Okay.
Everybody, all these brands are passed around, so
Right.
I can't remember who has it now or whatever. But they filed for a patent. They abandoned it. But the whole purpose of this application was to use an encapsulated form of citric acid to assist the kind of production of a marshmallowy type of confection during the process of actually creating the marshmallow, because you have to inject air in it, and that's done at a higher temperature.
It's fun.
Yeah, and it's fun. And you might say, why would you even need citric acid? Because citric acid makes it
Flavor.
yeah, it makes it taste better. And so they wanted that. But if you add the citric acid too early, especially with the heat and stuff, that will react with
A gooey
the
mess.
rest of the starches and all the other marshmallow type or whatever crumb type of topping that they were working on, those ingredients, and it would just jeopardize the entire structural integrity of the marshmallow, and it would just collapse.
Okay, so you need the citric acid for flavor, right? But if I'm hearing you correctly, help me out. If you add it too early, even as if maybe even in some of the formulations
Oh,
that
yeah.
we've done, if you add it too early, it really just kind of, for lack of a better word, craps out and gets gross.
Yeah, depending on the sophistication of the formula, right? So if somebody's using certain types of thickeners and stuff, that's where it might come to play.
That's interesting.
But, just from a food perspective, I could definitely see where the appeal is right there. So, you want to keep things from degrading,
Yeah.
or from having any kind of off-putting tastes that can sometimes derive.
Good.
And exactly. So that's where that is. So anyway, so those are some of the different ways maybe where citric acid kind of comes into our lives and what they're about, the different names and all that stuff.
Okay, so I should say, he has provided you so much information. I would have never in a million years guessed that citric acid was such a critical component in our daily, everyday use.
Yeah, well, I'm sure I didn't cover all uses for it, but at least
Oh my gosh, that's a lot.
least, the listeners, the viewers, whatever, you get a sense for why I feel that citric acid is such a core ingredient
It makes a lot more sense.
to any kind of formulation, whether it's a
Yes.
food, whether it's skincare, whether it's dental product, even if
It's
a
one you
toilet paper,
use.
it's one of my go-tos.
Always.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm sure we're gonna address it again.
I'm sure it'll come up.
Sure, in the future. Just it is. It's just so important. All right. And with that, alongside Tami, I'm Dr. We thank you for listening to this episode of Dental Formulators Playbook. Keep smiling and stay curious.